The Bacwezi. Demigods or humans? Myth or reality? In the previous episode, we talked about the Bacwezi as told by oral tradition. This group has attracted a lot of attention, for reasons that you can imagine. They are believed to have created the Empire of Kitara and also supposedly possess supernatural powers. Take a look at Ndoleriire. He's said to have created a hot spring simply by diving into a pool and heating it up with his body. Kagoro, as I mentioned in the last episode, was associated with lightning and thunder. He was able to summon it and ride it into heaven. But of course, they're also believed to have been kings. So who were they? There are quite a few opinions about who they were. First off, Bunyoro tradition refers to them as white people. Early collectors of Banyoro history such as Father Nicolette, Bishop Gorju, and historian John Nyakatura reason that they might have been Portuguese, and that that's how they got their name, Bachwezi. Portuguese, Bachwezi, Portuguese, Bachwezi. I mean, I guess I can see it. But as far as explanations go, this one is one hell of a stretch. Not only do the timelines not match, given that the Bacwezi are said to have ruled from the 1300s to the 1500s, and that also changes depending on the writer, the Portuguese didn't arrive till the 1400s. Also, there's nothing Portuguese about them. I mean, just look at the interaction of the Portuguese with some of the African kingdoms, such as the Songhai and Congo. The Portuguese wrote about them, and in the case of the Kingdom of Congo, were able to convert their king to Christianity. In Banyoro, no such impact was felt. Nyakatura further contemplates that perhaps they could have been Greeks or Egyptians who sailed down the Nile into the Great Lakes region. Possible. Egypt and Greece were well known and had a powerful influence in the ancient world. But again, there is no such influence recorded, especially if they had spent 200 years there or possibly even more in the Middle Ages. But I understand where this migraine-inducing theory came from. Oral tradition does state that they were white, and when Banyoro encountered Europeans in the 19th century, they assumed that they were the Bacwezi who had returned to take back their kingdom. However, the Banyoro also call the Arabs white. So it's obvious here that the word white is used for lighter-skinned individuals, not just of European descent. That includes light-skinned black people. Others, like Huntingford and Speke, believe that the Bacwezi were Hamites. The basis for their argument was the Hamitic hypothesis, and it goes that Ham from the Bible was cursed by Noah and thus his skin turned black. However, this theory is later changed to describe the Hamites as a deviation from Europeans. In the words of C.G. Seligman from his ethnographical work, The Races of Africa, and I quote, "The incoming Hamites were pastoral Europeans arriving wave after wave, better armed as well as quicker-witted than the dark agricultural Negroes." Close quotes. All of this is to say is that there's no way that us Negroids, as he calls us, came up with such complex state systems as they had found in the region. Examples being Bunyoro and Buganda. Only Europeans could do that. Duh. And since the Bacwezi are described as light-skinned pastoralists who rule those kingdoms, for them, the shoe fit. Then you have the historian Christopher Wrigley, who concludes that the Bacwezi were entirely fictional characters. His argument is that you have a pantheon of gods that were supposedly rulers, whose stories are chock full of fantasy. Why should anyone turn these legends into actual history? Wrigley uses the case of Kagoro, who is the lightning god in the Bacwezi pantheon, by comparing him to his fellow lightning counterparts around the world. He argues that nobody assumes that Indra, Thor, or Zeus were actual people. In the same vein, we shouldn't conclude that the Bacwezi were actual rulers. He continues to argue that this change was due to a shift in African writers during the colonial era, whereas before, these myths were taken for history. In the face of historical analysis, they don't hold up. So in order to be taken seriously, Wrigley says that the African writers such as Sir Apollo Kagwa of Buganda and John Nyakatura of Banyoro had to strip away the mythology and make the stories more based in reality. Alright, fair point. I can kind of see this happening. In fact, most historians concluded that the king lists that these two came up with were to a certain degree falsified. Let me explain why. During the colonial period, Banyoro experienced consequences as a result of their resistance towards the British invasion. Buganda, because they had sided with the British, were awarded some of Bunyoro's territory. This land was known as the Lost Counties, and there were 6 in total. Now, in order to get back that land, Banyoro tried to convince England that not only did that land belong to them, but that the entire region used to be theirs, by way of the Kitara Empire, which of course Buganda denied. So one way to do that was to publish their history. This resulted in writers from both kingdoms exaggerating their king lists in order to establish a pre-colonial dominance, and in Buganda's case, independent origin from Banyoro. You have to remember that these two kingdoms were in fierce competition with each other since before the arrival of the Europeans. Wrigley further argued that the Banyoro claim that the Bacwezi were their past kings was adopted at the dawn of colonial times. This, of course, is wrong. And as others, most notably Rene Dantella, have demonstrated, the Bacwezi being used as a legitimizing force happened way before colonial times. As you can see, there is no consensus on the identity of the Bacwezi or if they even existed. Personally, I accept that they did exist. I mean, I'm definitely biased because I'm from Uganda and this is what my ancestors believed. But there is another writer who offers a different perspective of the Bacwezi. You've heard me mention his name before. In his book, Mystique and Sovereign's Headgear, Bunyoro historian Yolamu Nsamba takes us on a journey down the kingdom's history. He reveals the history behind the folk tales. And that's what I'm going to do in this episode. I will talk about the history behind the veil of oral tradition. So, who were the Bacwezi? According to him, the Bacwezi, like the Musaza before them, were priests. Welcome to the 4th episode of the Bunyoro-Kitara series. My name is David Ibanda, and this is the Those Who Came Before Us podcast. As I was saying before, today we're going beyond the folk tales of the Bacwezi saga, and because of that, this episode is going to be different. It'll be more of a discussion rather than the narrative-driven episodes of before. I've attached a Google Drive link to the Kitara map in the description. This should help give everyone a mental image of some of the new information that I will be providing. I hope this helps. Let's begin. According to Nsamba, the Bacwezi were an occupational group of light-skinned individuals who practiced the religion of Kubandwa. They weren't white in the modern sense of the word, just light-skinned black people. But you might be asking yourself, then why call them white? This requires an understanding of the genetic makeup of the people in the region. Over the past hundreds of years, Uganda experienced a number of migrations into and out of the region. This included the Bantu groups, which are said to have come from West Africa and became the biggest ethnic group on the continent. Others include the Madi, the Shiluks, the Moru, and others from Central Sudan and Ethiopia. They intermarried with the local population and joined the culture. Some of the immigrants had lighter skin, so you can see how some of them might have been referred to as white. Okay, so what is this religion of Kubandwa that the Bacwezi practiced? In short, it focuses on spirit possession. These spirits have the names of prominent Bacwezi such as Ndahura, Kagoro, Wamara, Iwona, and up to 19 names. However, the Bacwezi didn't start this religion, but rather spread it across the land as they expanded their empire. And what facilitated this growth was the belief that the Bacwezi traveled with the spirits. Let me explain. The Kurama religion of the Musaza priests involved the worship of nature. Your hills, mountains, rivers, animals such as leopards and snakes. This meant that the spirit was tied to the land. People from far away had to come to the holy site of a particular spirit to witness its power or be blessed by it. With Kubandwa, the priests traveled the country and were able to summon spirits in any location. This allowed people better access to the spirits, and they were able to have their problems heard. It was a time of drought, after all, and the people were more than concerned. The Bacwezi priests were said to have traveled the country while forming blood-pact friendships such as the one that Nyamnyonga wanted from Isaza. This allowed them to establish nodes of ritual and secular authority all over the country. What this meant was that they were both religious and administrative leaders. So let's go back to the story of Isimbwa and Nyinamwiru from last episode. Isimbwa traveled to Bukuku's palace to see what his father's kingdom looked like. When there, he ended up having a relationship with Nyinamwiru. This story of romance is nothing more than an oversimplified version of events. Remember how I said that the Bacwezi traveled the country? Isimbwa was a Bacwezi, and his purpose for being at Bukuku's palace was to undermine his power. Remember that Bukuku had usurped the position of the Isaza, which, as I explained 2 episodes ago, was the title of the paramount priest of the Kurama religion. But he never got that title because his fellows refused to acknowledge him. Bukuku's fight to maintain power caused friction between him and the chiefs, and also the Python priestesses that I mentioned, and Nyinamwiru was one of them. Her name was a title too, by the way. So he imprisons Nyinamwiru, but she's befriended by Isimbwa, who converts her to his religion of Kubandwa. Now, tradition tells us that Isimbwa disguised himself as a trader and hunter, but he really was those things. He would provide iron tools to the places that he went to, and in this case, provided Nyinamwiru with weapons that she needed to enact her rebellion. These two became allies, and Nsamba tells us that Isimbwa visited villages guarded by Nyinamwiru and a young Ndahura. We'll get to him soon. Isimbwa's movements were secretive, mysterious. It was said that he would emerge from the ground to a crowd of believers at locations that recognized his power. And he continued spreading Kubandwa with the help of his recruits, addressing the shortage of pasture and water caused by the drought by providing alternative livelihoods by way of ivory hunting, salt production, and metalwork trade. This, of course, resulted in the loss of power for the Masaza priests, such as Bukuku when he was speared to death by Ndahura. Now let's turn our attention to Ndahura. He's the conqueror, the one who legend tells us created the legendary Empire of Kitara. However, Nsamba tells us that these wars that he fought were not done by one person, but rather a number of kings. Are you still with me? Unfortunately, legend doesn't tell us how much time passes in these stories. It turns out that Ndahura, just like Isaza and Nyinamwiru, was also a title. It was a title given to the leaders of the Bagabo clan during what Nsamba calls the Ndahura Karubumbi dynasty. The reason for the shortening of dynastic history into individuals is not easily understood. It's highly likely it was just easier to remember that way, given that Banyoro didn't have a writing system. Now, these kings were Masaza priests, but were converted to Kubandwa by Isimbwa, and as Bacwezi priest kings, they became popular due to their ability to manage scarce resources among the cattle clans during this era of drought. But they had rivals with whom they were in fierce competition with. The main ones being the Bacwezi of the Basingo clan, headed by yours truly, Mugenyi. You remember him. His mother Nyangoma tried to assassinate Mulindwa, who tradition tells us was her stepson, and he was in love with her. You know, the guy that fell into a pit of hot water. Well, it turns out Mulindwa was the Bacwezi head of the Bayaga clan, and then we have the Bacwezi of the Basaigi clan, headed by Kagoro. We also have the Bacwezi of the Bamuli clan, headed by Wamara, and there are some others as well. This is where some people contest the idea of calling Kitara an empire. Most historians agree that the empire was a collection of loosely connected polities and clans. It wasn't centralized. These clans were headed by various Bacwezi who controlled territory that were sovereign in their own right. However, the Ndahura kings enjoyed dominance over the others from time to time and would be called the father, which Nsamba compares the use of the word to that in modern religions, like the Pope in the Catholic Church, who is seen as the father of all priests. And this would change, though, now and again as the power of the other Bacwezi grew, most notably that of Wamara. In fact, in Nkore, Renee Tantala notes that Wamara was the leading Bacwezi and took precedence over Ndahura. But they weren't just motivated for religious reasons. The bigger motivation for the Bacwezi was actually economic. The best example for this was Ndahura's attack on Nsinga. This is a guy who was accused of witchcraft and then subsequently thrown off a cliff into the waters of Lake Albert. Nsinga could have survived, but the problem is that he failed to read the room. While other Musaza priests were giving in willingly to the power of the Bachwezi, Nsinga decided to hold on to his polity of Bugama, which controlled a crossing at the Kabale River. You see, Nsinga collected levies at this crossing through which Ndahura could get to Chibiro, which is home to an ancient salt industry. Salt was in high demand in the region, not just for the people, but also to feed large herds of cattle. If you know anything about cattle keeping, you know that cows need to consume salt in their diet on a regular. Cows were important to the Bachwezi. They were a symbol of wealth, power, status, lifestyle, and identity. So Ndahura launched a combined attack with the other Bachwezi on Nsinga. This, as you know, resulted in his watery death. After this, Ndahura wore Nsinga's red parrot feather crown, which was a symbol of trade and wealth. This was an attempt for him to reassure Nsinga's subjects that he could continue trade just like his predecessor. The fall of Nsinga gave Ndahura control over trade on the Nile River region and Lake Albert. Historians agree that the Great Lakes region had its own internal trade networks, and that it wasn't until the 19th century that they had access to the outside world. That being said, Nsamba offers a different perspective. He tells us that there is evidence that they were part of networks that reached as far as Egypt, Asia Minor, and the Far East. The fact that iron rod money was once used in Banyoro, which was used in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece, is evidence of this. Furthermore, excavations in Chibiro revealed Indian glass beads which were dated to 850 AD. So that does tell you something. I mean, if anything, the migrations into the region should already demonstrate that the region wasn't locked off. Perhaps we might need to reconsider this view that the Great Lakes region was isolated. Getting back to Nsinga, unfortunately, Ndahura's attempts to reassure the Musaza priests in Bugoma failed. It was natural for them to resist. They had been taken over and were now being forced to switch religions to Kubandwa. So they protested, using night dancing. I know, most of you don't know what this means. But those of you from East Africa might be shocked since you know night dancing is witchcraft and demonic. Which it is. But it started out as a political protest against repressive leaders. So one would paint themselves in ashes and go into someone's compound, dance, and plant a disemboweled frog with plucked out eyes and a tongue, all the while proclaiming that the target's eyes and stomach will burst like that of the frog. It's terrifying. The practice of night dancing also includes other things such as someone stripping off their clothes, running from house to house, and causing a ruckus, dancing, and making noises in the dead of the night. There is a BBC documentary on the practice in Kenya. There they call it night running, but it's essentially the same thing. I've included a link in the description if you're interested. So the Bachwezi start to call the Musaza priests night dancers and sorcerers, but they don't just stop there. Oh no, any dissenting voice was branded a sorcerer. And this accusation resulted in them being executed by way of drowning, which was the Bachwezi's favorite method of the death penalty. Nsinga's Bugoma polity soon turned into Orusaka Oruiragura. I am definitely saying that wrong, but it's Runyora for a place where people are sent to be executed. This, of course, drove away business and power shifted to Mlindwa of the Buyaga clan due to his alliance with the Ndahura. The Ndahura kings maintained their dominance until they decided to be reckless. If you remember, oral tradition tells us that he went to war with a king called Bwide Butakya in Ihangiro in present-day Tanzania. This ended with the defeat and capture of Ndahura, although he was then rescued. That part is correct, but it leaves out the manner in which the story of the Ndahura dynasty ends. You see, after his failed campaign, Ndahura snuck back into his kingdom at night. Oral tradition paints him as a disgraced yet honorable king who refused to resume his position despite the pleas of his subjects. Folks, that's just not the case. It turns out Ndahura did want his throne back, but first, he went to Chiro, who legend calls his son, and demanded he share with him his war spoils. This didn't go over well because when we listen to the songs that Kubandwa mediums sing about Ndahura, they tell us that he was seized by his fellow Bacwezi, Chiro and Kagoro, and he was taken away, never to be seen again. By this, Nsamba tells us, we can conclude that he was killed or forced to do so himself. As I mentioned before in ancient Banyoro, whenever kings disgraced themselves or were injured in battle, custom demanded that they commit suicide by drinking a mixture of milk and honey laced with poison. Clans headed by Bacwezi were in fierce competition. Of course they took advantage of the Ndahura military failure. And this ended their reign. According to Banyoro dynastic history, Wamara, the son of Ndahura, was chosen as the next king. His rise to power was captured in Banyoro legend in the wounding of Mulindwa by Nyangoma. Of course, this legend is a simplified and summarized version of actual events. First, Wamara was not Ndahura's son. In fact, none of the Bacwezi were related by blood despite being remembered as a family. And just like the Ndahura kings, Wamara was a title given to the Bacwezi leaders of the Bamuli clan. The fall of Ndahura was capitalized on by Wamara with alliances from Kagoro and Mulindwa. What ended up happening was that Ndahura's loss caused the dissolution of the Bacwezi alliance that he had managed to put together, and this left Wamara as the most powerful Bacwezi left. However, the end of the alliance meant that Wamara had to struggle to maintain order and power. The most notable opposition to Wamara's regime was Mugenyi of the Basingo clan. He's the one that we talked about last episode, who was so in love with his cows that if it died, he would kill himself. Yeah, that's him. His clan naturally wanted him to replace Ndahura, but Wamara was able to carry out the legitimacy rites and became Ndahura's heir. So how did he do this? To explain this, let's go back to Ndahura's death. In another version of Banyoro court tradition, it said that Ndahura had fallen into a hole and descended to the land of ghosts. He was then pulled out by his servant Nyamutale. And what did I say that falling into a hole meant in Banyoro history? It was a metaphor for death. But the story also tells of Ndahura's rebirth as a spiritual being, because the story goes that Nyamutale pulls Ndahura out of the underworld, or the land of ghosts, and in the Kubandwa religion, pulling someone from the underworld meant pulling out their spirit. This spirit then possesses the medium, but in the event of legitimizing a ruler, the spirit of the predecessor, in this case would be Ndahura, is pulled and then mounted on the head of the successor to possess them. This spirit then speaks through the host and proclaims this person to be their heir. And this is how Ndahura and Isimbwa legitimized themselves. Isaza's spirit was summoned and declared them heirs. And just like that, Wamara became Ndahura's heir, or as oral tradition calls him, Ndahura's son. This ritual is referred to as spiritual apotheosis. So Wamara legitimizes himself, much to the dismay of the other clans, especially Mugenyi's Basingo clan. They did not like the Wamara kings, for competitional reasons, yes, but also because they considered them to be uncouth. The Basingo clan turned up their noses from Wamara because of his tendency to eat wild game, a thing that he did due to his muddy heritage and was also not a Banyoro custom. Remember how I talked about the various groups coming into the region and joining the Banyoro? This is an example of that. So the Basingo clan refused to pay Wamara tribute, which resulted in him calling them rebels and attacking them. And naturally, his allies in Mulindwa and Kagoro supported his use of force. This put them on the hit list and resulted in Nyangoma almost killing Mulindwa. Oral tradition called her his stepmom, and that Mulindwa was in love with her. But not only was she none of those things, she was so much more. Nyangoma was the priestess of the Buruli polity inhabited by the Basuli clan. She was also the priestess of the Python at the Kafu River. Since the Basuli and Basingo clan had similar interests in their resistance to Wamara, Nyangoma fought for them and Mugenyi. Her attack on Mulino was fatal, and he ended up dying from his wounds. For this, there were to be severe consequences. Wamara mobilized his forces and began a campaign of extermination against Mugenyi and his clan. Kagoro and Wamara persecuted the Basingo clan so much that they had to flee southwards. Do you want to know what Wamara's praise name was? He was called Njojowi Gunda, which means the thumping elephant that tramples everything in its path. And trample he did. He quickly gained a reputation for vengeance against those who rebelled, trying desperately to maintain the dominance that the Ndahura kings had established. His efforts were essentially an exercise in whack-a-mole. However, he did try some other things in order to mitigate the situation. Wamara sought to consolidate his power base by giving out gifts of cattle and loans to cattle-keeping clans. It was an attempt for him to endear himself to them. He also separated ritual from secular authority by appointing rulers in various parts of the country who were not priests. This was very different from all the rulers up until this point, who both possessed ritual and secular power. It's unclear if this worked, but we do know that the Bacwezi Empire was a full-speed bullet train headed for collapse. For starters, the Banyoro had been plagued by drought, famine, and disease. Banyoro legend tells us that the skin diseases that the people suffered from had been brought back by Ndaura and his armies. The people turned to the religion of Kubanda to alleviate their suffering, but nothing happened. Nothing changed. You can only imagine the growing frustration of the people. And it also didn't help that the Bacwezi were extremely repressive. They demanded tribute, and when not received, they would drown people, which, as I said, was their preferred method of execution. Enemies of the Bacwezi were drowned anywhere. Rivers, swamps, lakes, cattle watering troughs, you take your pick. You've got a hill that's overlooking a body of water? Even better. Rebellions rose up across the country, and legend tells tales of dark creatures that haunted the Bacwezi and drove their cattle from lakes whenever they went to drink. These creatures were actually rebels fighting against the Bacwezi. They used the metaphor of dark supernatural creatures in order to describe them. That's just how repulsive they saw them. This kind of narrative falls in line with the propaganda that the Bacwezi spread by calling anyone who went against them as sorcerers and night dancers. Things were bad for Wamara, but they were about to get so much worse. The rebellions naturally increased demand for iron weapons. As they acquired more and more of them, something else happened. The Banyoro began doing more agriculture and less cattle herding. This was not good for the Bacwezi elite. Why? Because more and more farmers meant that they needed more land. Land which the Bacwezi owned for grazing their cattle. To make matters even worse, Kagoro, who was Wamara's ally, began feeding this agricultural revolution. His polity mined and supplied the people with iron tools and weapons, and in the process, broke the Bacwezi monopoly on metal production. This caused an emergence of new rulers that Nsamba calls early Iron Age leaders. These rulers encouraged the shift to more agriculture. Eventually, young people refused to go on cattle stealing raids with the Bacwezi. For them, it was more fruitful and fulfilling to just stay home and grow food, rather than risk their lives trying to steal cows from foreign nations. As for Kagoro, well, his participation in the societal change was noted, and his fellows confronted him. This did not end well for them. There is a reason why he is associated with lightning and thunder. Lightning is loud, flashy, quickly destructive and terrifying, and just like lightning, Kagoro rained terror on his colleagues who opposed his work. In the last episode, I mentioned that the theories on the end of the Bacwezi were that either they drowned themselves in Lake Albert, or that they left the country. However, according to the Baha'i in northern Tanzania, Kagoro was actually the one who subjected them to it. His dissenting fellow Bacwezi were drowned en masse in Lake Albert, and this image of Bacwezi bodies floating in Lake Albert was immortalized in the Banyoro societal psyche. Others sought shelter in shrines across the country, which Banyoro military rules prohibit action against. And when there, they pleaded with the spirits of past kings for help. Many Bacwezi fled, which was probably the source of the second theory in oral tradition. Kogoro had staged his coup and broken Wamara's power base. The cattle-keeping clans that he had bribed deserted him. Many of them lost land for pasture and were unable to maintain their large herds. Some of them even committed suicide. And as these two clashed, a third power appeared on the scene, one that had been growing for generations during Bacwezi rule. It was a power that had grown tired of the aggression of the current rulers. This group would later win this battle for control in the Great Lakes region and establish themselves as the third dynasty of Banyoro, known as the Babito. And it all started when they had the audacity to crown a man called Rukidi as the king in Wamara's capital, in his own backyard. You know, there's poking the bear, and then there's slapping it in the face, or in Wamara's case, slapping the elephant in the face. You know, because he's called the thumping elephant that crushed his enemies underneath his feet. Anyways, the Babito had to flee and were accepted by Ndahura's clan, the Bagabo, which, as I mentioned, went into decline after Ndahura's defeat in Tanzania. Through an alliance, Rukidi was then made king. They then went on to make multiple alliances with various clans, including the one of Nsinga who was thrown off a cliff by Ndahura many generations ago. These alliances did not come free, though. For example, in order to get an alliance with one clan called the Babito had to they had to kill this individual, basically. This man was a Bacwezi agent who collected tribute for them. And judging by the track record of the Bacwezi, you can best believe that he was doing it violently. Another clan that they had to make an alliance with was the Basuli clan, and they were promised to be the ones in charge of ritual authority while Rukidi maintained secular or political power. They were willing to continue this new system of government that Wamara had began. Remember the diviners from last episode's story? The ones who told the Bacwezi it was time for them to leave? This is them. This clan has an interesting story. They started out as the cattle keepers for Wamara's herd until one day, one of their leaders who doubled as a priest and cattle keeper decided to take up metalworking. And over these fires, he would tell fortunes. And one of these fortunes was the end of the Bacwezi. Soon, members of his clan were saying things like, "The end is nigh. The Bacwezi will soon be no more." At least, I'm guessing. The point is, the Basuli claimed to foresee the destruction of the Bacwezi, and people started to believe this. You can only imagine what it was like for Wamara watching his former subjects shout themselves hoarse about his demise. And in time, the Babito had amassed an alliance of over 60 clans that have the Bushbuck as their totem. This clash between the Babito and Wamara is visualized as a hawk attacking an elephant, which reminds me of Rock, a Middle Eastern mythical bird big enough to carry an elephant. It said that in the end, Wamara abandoned the throne, and Kogoro was defeated. As you can see, the Bacwezi saga was actually about a struggle for dominance between competing clans, and at one point, were able to come together as a large, loosely decentralized state that historians call an empire. Legend presents the Bacwezi as these mythical people, akin to gods, and in fact, are worshipped as deities in the religion of Kubandwa, which they spread. But Nsamba reveals to us their humanness. They started out as a better option to themselves as a priests, but then descended into despotism as they demanded tribute from those they subjugated. They wielded violence in attempts to squash dissent, and that very violence, coupled with environmental stresses such as drought and disease, forced the populace to rise up in rebellion. You might ask yourself how the Bacwezi came to be seen as deities then. If they were despised enough to inspire an uprising, how then did they become gods? It is for exactly that reason that they became deities. Banyoro deified rulers that threatened them. For example, Kogoro, who was equated to lightning and thunder, his brutality was so overwhelming that he was compared to it. His deification was an attempt by Banyoro to manage the violence that they were subjected to by him. The hope was that if they prayed to him and offered sacrifices to him, they would be spared from his wrath. A more recent example of this happening is during the onset of the colonial era. The war of conquest by Britain against Bunyoro caused so much destruction that they created a spirit for them. This spirit was called Mbandwa Enjungu, which translates to force of Europeans. And just like the Bacwezi, it was an attempt for them to control their fate. It happened again with the Polish during World War II, when they were brought as refugees to Uganda. The arrival of huge numbers of white people caused anxiety among the Banyoro, who saw it as a threat similar to that of the British. And for that, they created Mbandwa Mpolandi, which means force of Polishness. You can also see this as an attempt for them to understand changes to their environment by translating it into something that they understood. For the Banyoro, the only way for a group like that to have such power was through supernatural means. To them, the British were obviously being backed by a powerful spirit. Anyways, this is the end of the episode. I will be continuing the history of Banyoro till we get to colonial times. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already, and spread the word if you know anyone that's interested in African history. Thank you for listening, and tune in next time on the Those Who Came Before Us podcast.